First Lady Melania Trump, she held a rare news conference today, speaking decisively as she denied any ties to sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, saying, quote, "The lies linking me with the disgraceful Jeffrey Epstein need to end today."
Hey guys, Hannah is here. So, what is going on? The question being asked inside Washington right now is not about policy or politics. It is something far more alarming. Did the President of the United States have no idea his own wife was about to walk to the White House podium and publicly address the single most explosive scandal of his entire second term? Because if he did not know, that is not a communications failure. That is a presidency that has lost control of itself from the inside. Think about what that sentence implies. In a functional political operation, in any White House going back to the founding of the Republic, the First Lady does not simply materialize at the podium like a political apparition. There are speechwriters. There are communications directors. There are legal counsels who scrub every single syllable for potential liability. There is a scheduling office that coordinates the timing of the address with the news cycle and, crucially, with the president's own public schedule.
Melania Trump breaking her silence today on Jeffrey Epstein, a story, a scandal that has consumed this White House off and on for much of the last year. Melania Trump has never responded to questions about Epstein or about the more than 100 times her name is mentioned in the newly released Epstein files. Today, she did both, suggesting that her conversations and connections with Epstein were merely social, the product of overlapping between Palm Beach and New York City, and denied several specific claims about her and linkages to Epstein.
There is a process that is as rigid and as predictable as the changing of the guard at Arlington. And at the very center of that process, at the absolute nucleus of power, is the West Wing. And the West Wing answers to one person.
So, Katie, that mention of the Epstein files, there really hasn't been much talk about them lately because of the war, but they are front and center again in D.C.
There was a remarkable moment at the White House, Adrian. The First Lady, Melania Trump, delivered a statement that seemingly came out of the blue. She called on Congress to hold open public hearings for the victims of the Epstein files and distanced herself from Jeffrey Epstein.
So when the First Lady stepped into the frame, adjusted the microphone, and began speaking about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, the entire political world operated under the very reasonable assumption that this was a coordinated, vetted, and strategically deployed piece of messaging. But it was not. And the president's own words, delivered to reporters less than a day later, confirmed that the machinery of the White House had completely and catastrophically broken down. Let me paint the full picture for you. The First Lady stands before the press corps. The gravity of the setting, the White House seal, the flags, the formal lectern gives the moment an undeniable weight.
Numerous fake images and statements about Epstein and me have been circulating on social media for years now. Be cautious about what you believe. These images and stories are completely false. I'm not a witness or a named witness in connection with any of Epstein's crimes.
She proceeds to deliver a statement that is laser-focused on severing the public connection between her household and the sprawling, grotesque network of Jeffrey Epstein. She states with firm and deliberate cadence that she was not a victim of Epstein. She declares with equal force that the disgraced financier did not serve as the matchmaker who brought her together with Donald Trump. She characterizes the swirling allegations and the intense public scrutiny of her past social proximity to Epstein's orbit as baseless lies.
My name has never appeared in court documents, depositions, victim statements, or FBI interviews surrounding the Epstein matter. I have never had any knowledge of Epstein abuse of his victims. I was never involved in any capacity. I was not a participant, was never on Epstein's plane.
And then, in a move that seemed designed to project transparency and empathy, she called for congressional hearings to give a platform to the actual survivors of Epstein's abuse. On its face, read from a teleprompter, it was a classic piece of crisis communications. Deny, deflect, demand a process. It was designed to put a period at the end of a sentence that the media had been trying to extend for years. But the period turned out to be a comma, and the next clause of that sentence was written in indelible ink by the document release that hit the very next day.
Denying that she was introduced to Donald Trump by Jeffrey Epstein, and denying having any knowledge of Epstein's crimes, his abuse of women and girls, or denying even that she herself might have been a victim. Melania Trump has, in recent weeks, aggressively, along with her team, sought retractions and clarifications on stories in the press that have suggested she might have been closer to Epstein or more intimately involved in any aspects of his life or connections even with her husband or with other powerful men.
Because while the First Lady was calling the scrutiny baseless, the machinery of the Epstein Files Transparency Act was grinding forward, completely indifferent to the political needs of the White House. And when that machinery produced its latest batch of records, it contained a payload that detonated directly underneath the podium where Melania had been standing just hours earlier. Emails, documented, date-stamped, written correspondence from the year 2002 between Melania Trump and Ghislaine Maxwell.
Today, she took that step further, noting that she would continue to be seeking those retractions and calling the efforts to somehow link her to Epstein defamatory and smears, and suggesting that people were trying to politically spite or attack her with those claims. But perhaps most important, and the thing that could have the longest tail out of the First Lady's remarks today, she called for Congress to have open and public hearings with Epstein's victims so that their voices might become a part of the record.
Ghislaine Maxwell, the convicted sex trafficker, the woman who a jury of her peers determined was the operational right hand of Jeffrey Epstein, the procurer, the facilitator, the keeper of the secrets. And here was written proof that the current First Lady of the United States had been on the other end of an email chain with her. The administration's response was swift and utterly predictable. They attached the label casual correspondence to the emails and tried to minimize their significance. But you cannot minimize a document that is now part of the permanent congressional record. You cannot wish away the visual of the First Lady calling questions about her ties to Maxwell baseless, only to have the basis for those very questions land on the front page less than a full news cycle later. And then came the moment that transformed this from a mere political embarrassment into a full-blown portrait of a White House in chaos. The president faced the press pool. He was asked point-blank about his wife's dramatic intervention, and instead of offering a supportive nod or a unified front, he claimed ignorance. He looked into the cameras and told the world that he had no prior knowledge of the address. He found out about his own wife's speech on the most sensitive topic of his presidency the same way the rest of us did after it was already over. Let that sink in. The commander-in-chief, the man who demands absolute loyalty and total control over the narrative, admitted that he was completely out of the loop on a White House address delivered by a member of his own family about a scandal that involves convicted sex offenders and long-standing questions about his own social calendar. The reports that filtered out in the aftermath of this admission painted a picture of a West Wing in turmoil. The word furious was used, not mildly annoyed, not slightly frustrated, furious. The president, already besieged by legal challenges and sinking poll numbers, was reportedly incandescent with rage that the speech had been given without his sign-off and, more importantly, that it had been given on the eve of the Maxwell email release, thereby shining the brightest possible spotlight on the very documents he would have preferred to see buried in the Friday night news cycle. The First Lady's attempt to put out the fire had, in a stunning act of political miscalculation or willful defiance, poured an entire tanker truck of fuel onto the embers. And the survivors of Epstein's abuse, the very people Melania claimed to be advocating for with her call for hearings, watched this unfold and issued their own verdict. They called it what it was, deflection. They accused the First Lady of using carefully parsed legal language to dodge genuine accountability while the documentary evidence of her proximity to the operation continued to pile up in the public domain. This is the landscape we must now navigate. It is a landscape of fractured communication, documentary contradiction, and a level of internal White House dysfunction that is genuinely unprecedented. To understand how we arrived at this singular moment of political chaos, we have to dissect the statements made at that podium, the emails that surfaced the following day, and the institutional collapse of the Epstein file management strategy that made this entire public relations disaster possible. Let us start with the language of the address itself. Every single word uttered by Melania Trump at that podium was a piece of legal architecture. This was not a heartfelt, off-the-cuff expression of frustration. It was a fortress built of conditional clauses and narrow denials. The statement, "I am not Epstein's victim," is the cornerstone of that fortress. Notice what it does not say. It does not say, I had no relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. It does not say, I was never in his social sphere. It does not say, my name appears nowhere in his records. It says one very specific and very defensible thing. I was not harmed by him. In the context of a criminal enterprise built on the exploitation and abuse of vulnerable young women, positioning oneself as a non-victim is a legal distinction, not a moral exoneration of the broader association. It is a way of standing apart from the suffering without denying the proximity. It is the language of a deposition, not a diary entry. Then came the claim about the origin of her marriage. Epstein did not introduce me to Donald Trump. This is a specific factual rebuttal to a specific long-standing rumor. It is designed to sever the origin story of the Trump political dynasty from the rotting reputation of Epstein. It is a clean break, or at least it was meant to be. Finally, the rhetorical crescendo, baseless lies. This was the attempt to delegitimize the entire journalistic and legal inquiry into the Epstein-Trump social nexus. It was a blanket dismissal of any and all scrutiny, and it was this specific word, baseless, that the Epstein Files Transparency Act decided to contradict with the cold, hard reality of the 2002 Maxwell emails. You cannot call something baseless when the documentary basis for the question arrives in a court-sanctioned release 24 hours later. The word baseless is now a monument to either astonishing hubris or astonishing incompetence in the White House communications operation. The emergence of the Maxwell emails is the pivot point of this entire saga. These were not transcripts of intercepted phone calls or the claims of anonymous sources. These were written communications between the woman who would become First Lady and the woman who would become a convicted sex trafficker. The timing, 2002, places the correspondence squarely in the period when Epstein's activities in Palm Beach and New York were an open secret within certain elite social circles. The administration's attempt to wave this away as casual correspondence is perhaps the most problematic part of the entire spin operation. There is nothing casual about corresponding with Ghislaine Maxwell. She was not a casual acquaintance. She was the operational manager of a sex trafficking ring. The email exchanges, regardless of their specific content about dinner plans or holiday greetings, establish a direct, documented line of communication. They confirm that Melania Trump was not merely someone who happened to be in the same room as Epstein once or twice. She was someone with whom Maxwell maintained contact. That is the basis. That is the foundation. And it makes the baseless lies characterization look either deeply uninformed or deliberately misleading. And this brings us to the crux of the internal power struggle that the president inadvertently exposed. Trump's admission of no prior knowledge is a window into a West Wing that is not just leaking, it is losing control entirely. If the president is telling the truth, it means Melania Trump and her small insular East Wing operation acted unilaterally. They either did not consult with the West Wing communications and legal teams, or they consulted with them and were told not to do the speech, and they did it anyway. Both scenarios are significant. The first scenario suggests that the East Wing has gone its own way, that the First Lady is operating as a free agent with her own agenda and her own legal exposure to manage, separate and apart from the president's political survival. The second scenario suggests that the president is either not being forthcoming to cover for a botched strategy, or even worse, that his own staff defied a direct order and he is too weak or too distracted to enforce discipline. The reports of Trump's fury support the idea that this was not a coordinated strategy. This was a genuine blindsiding, and a president who can be blindsided by his own wife in his own house on the biggest scandal of his term is a president who is projecting weakness, not strength. The survivor community's response to this spectacle is not just a footnote. It is the moral compass of the entire story. These are individuals who have spent years being dismissed by powerful institutions and powerful people. They know the playbook of deflection better than any lawyer or public relations representative. When Melania stood at that podium and called their pursuit of truth-baseless lies, while her own emails with Maxwell sat in a repository waiting to be released, they recognized the pattern instantly. It is the pattern of the elite closing ranks. It is the pattern of using technical, legalistic language to obscure the simple human truth of association and enabling. Their accusation of deflection carries immense weight because they are the ones who suffered the consequences of the world looking the other way while Epstein and Maxwell operated. And now, thanks to Melania's own call for congressional hearings, these survivors are going to have a front row seat and a powerful microphone as the very documents that contradict her statements are entered into the official record. Let us pull the camera back even further to see the institutional damage that made this moment inevitable. The administration's entire strategy for managing the Epstein fallout relied on two key figures who are now either gone or compromised. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, was supposed to be the gatekeeper. She was removed from the equation amid accusations that her management of the file releases was less about transparency and more about protection, specifically protection of administration figures whose names might appear in the documents. With Bondi out, the gate was left swinging open. Then there is the situation with Kash Patel at the FBI. The class action lawsuit filed by FBI agents alleges that the Bureau, under Patel's influence, has been actively using redaction authority and bureaucratic delay to shield the president's interests from the full scope of the Epstein documentation. Whether those allegations are proven in court or not, the mere existence of the lawsuit creates a cloud of illegitimacy over every document the FBI releases or withholds. It creates a presumption of a cover-up. Into this vacuum of institutional control stepped Melania Trump, and she stepped right into the path of an oncoming train of document releases. The April 8th address and the April 9th email release are not two separate stories. They are the cause and effect of a communication strategy that was flying completely blind. Either the people who prepared Melania's speech were too uninformed to check what was in the immediate release pipeline under the Transparency Act, or they were deliberately kept in the dark by an East Wing operation that did not care about the documentary record. Either way, the result was a self-inflicted wound of the highest order. She called for the very mechanism, congressional hearings with subpoena power, that will now be used to compel testimony about the precise nature and context of those 2002 Maxwell emails. She has effectively invited Congress to put her own correspondence under a microscope. This is the specific irony of the congressional hearings demand. It was meant to sound magnanimous. It was meant to sound like she was on the side of the victims. But in the context of the Maxwell email reveal, it became a trapdoor. Congressional investigators now have the justification they need to ask questions that the White House absolutely does not want to answer. They can subpoena the full unredacted email chain. They can ask who else was copied on those emails. They can ask about the frequency of the contact. They can ask about the transition of that relationship as Epstein's legal troubles began to mount in the mid-2000s. And they can do all of this under the banner of heeding the First Lady's call for transparency. She handed them the sword, and the Maxwell emails gave them the means to use it. The political fallout from this sequence is not confined to the insular world of Washington. It radiates outward into the electorate at the worst possible moment for this administration. We are on a collision course with midterm elections. The suburban voters, particularly women, who decide the fate of swing districts, are watching this. They are watching a first lady who has cultivated an image of elegant, dignified distance get dragged into the Epstein scandal through documented emails with a convicted sex trafficker. They are watching a president who claims to be in control admit that he has no idea what his own wife is doing. This is not a story about policy. It is a story about character, about trust, and about whether the people at the very top of the pyramid are being honest about who they are and who they associate with. The Maxwell emails are a receipt, and in the court of public opinion, receipts matter more than podium speeches. Looking forward, the trajectory of this scandal is clear, and it is unyielding. The congressional hearing process will grind forward. The Maxwell emails are now Exhibit A in the argument for deeper investigation. The casual correspondence defense will be stress-tested by investigators who can demand context. The survivors will continue to amplify their message that the powerful are deflecting rather than disclosing. And the president, caught between a desire to shut this down and a wife who appears to be operating on her own separate track, will face an impossible choice. Does he attack the process and look like he is hiding something? Or does he let the process play out and risk more documents, more emails, and more connections surfacing? The bottom line is this. Melania Trump walked to that podium to end the speculation. She wanted to put a lid on the Epstein discussion. Instead, she blew the lid off. She exposed the deep, irreconcilable fractures within the Trump political operation. She exposed the documentary evidence that contradicts her own strongest denial. And she set in motion a congressional inquiry that will now inevitably turn its gaze toward the email exchanges between between the First Lady and Ghislaine Maxwell. The scandal is no longer just about what happened 20 years ago. It is about what is happening right now inside a White House that has lost the ability to manage its own message. And the president, the man who is supposed to be in charge of everything, is left standing in front of reporters looking confused and admitting he was the last person in the room to know what was going on. That is the picture of a presidency that is no longer in control of its own destiny. And that picture is worth far more than 1,000 words. The hearings have not even started yet. The document releases are ongoing. The subpoenas are being drafted. The survivors are watching. And the midterms are right around the corner. This story has legs, and those legs are walking directly into the campaign ads that will define the rest of this political year. The First Lady's podium moment was supposed to be the end of the conversation. It turned out to be the beginning of an entirely new and far more dangerous chapter. The email is in the record. The denial is on tape. And the contradiction between the two is the story that will not go away.